Everybody, and welcome to this very short course on the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, where we'll fundamentally be discussing the Mask of Anarchy, apart from a few shorter poems like the Skylark the and the poem called Ozymandias. But prior to that, what today's talk is primarily going to discuss is the issue of Romanticism. Now, many of our students, while they go into the romantic study of romantic poetry, put forward this question: what exactly was Romanticism? Was there one Romanticism? What tied this diverse bands of poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley together? Were there any particular kinds of of tendencies, themes that were brought into their poems? How did this phenomenon called Romanticism interact with the age just prior to it? Was 1798 one watershed moment, or was the movement called Romanticism already in motion prior to 1798 when the preface to the Lyrical Ballads was published? It is to answer these questions that I approach the movement called Romanticism. And I take the opportunity of approaching this through several paintings of the period. And therefore, I have titled this presentation, which I'll now share with you, of Infinities and Ratios, Romanticism through the Other Arts. I do hope this is visible for you. In just a moment, as this goes into the mode, as it were, the presentation mode, as it were. Please do excuse me for a moment. Right. So I've titled this of Infinities and Ratios, Romanticism through the Other Arts, primarily through painting. I initially did have a bit of music added to this presentation, but I decided against playing it because of my technical incompetence more than anything else. Now, my questions here are: what was Romanticism? Can there be one definition or reading of Romanticism? What was its relationship with the prior period of the Enlightenment? Of course, the Enlightenment was a continuing movement, but how did Romanticism interact with the literature of the 18th century? Being students of literature, can we perceive it in a more holistic way through the other arts? I would say, rather than look at it purely from the textual point of view, which you will be doing in your syllabus anyway, is there another way of looking at it through the realm of paintings? Now, let me first come to this concept of Romanticism itself, the definitions. Now, it has been defined as a literary movement and profound shift in sensibility. So kind of a paradigm shift in sensibility, which took place in Britain and throughout Europe roughly between 1770 and 1848. So you see, 1798, the date of publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads, is just one moment within the broader parameters of Romanticism, which we can situate between 1770 and 1848. Intellectually, it marked a violent reaction to the Enlightenment, especially the Enlightenment precept of reason, order, decorum. These ideas were reacted against by Romanticism. Politically, Romanticism was a progressive movement in the sense that it responded to the French Revolution, It responded to the American Revolution and was marked by an opening up of poetry to these issues of revolution, in Shelley's case, anarchy, and especially in the ways in which political rights and freedoms and the question of government came up during this period. So, a progressive movement that opened up towards revolution. Emotionally, it expressed an extreme assertion of the self and value of individual experience rather than an objective, omniscient look at society. Romanticism was marked by an extreme assertion of the self. So, the subjective poetic eye becomes very important here, and the value of individual experience. So, when Charles Lamb, for example, writes Dream Children, it's his subjective experience to the realities around him that mark the stamp of Romanticism. And this is coupled with a sense of the infinite and the transcendental. You see, this is very important. The self in society, or the self as a member of a society, is something that the earlier Augustan age also looked at. But Romanticism seeks to bridge the self with the infinite, the transcendental, and the sublime. Right? So, when the Romantic poet looks at nature, for example, he will talk about the sublimity within it. Or say, when Blake talks about innocence and experience, the self seeks to cross the boundaries of immediate history and move into the realm of the pure realm of imagination and emotions and the transcendental. Or for that matter, you see always the soaring motion of the bird figure in Romanticism that seeks to cross the ephemeral, the life, and move into the immortal. Take a look at Keats, for example. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. So the infinite, the transcendental, beyond time and space, beyond immediate time and space, is what the Romantics is looking at. So when Wordsworth writes the Lucy poems, for example, Lucy is absorbed and moves around in the diurnal course, right, which is beyond time itself, which is eternal, right? So this selfhood being absorbed into the infinite and the transcendental is a very important aspect of the Romantic movement. Socially, of course, it championed progressive causes. You will see how Shelley, later on in my course, in The Mask of Anarchy, talks about non-violence as a kind of way of responding to the protests of extreme exploitation and brutalities. But the stylistic keynote of Romanticism is intensity, be it Wordsworth's intensity in the Stolen Boat episode or in Tintern Abbey, be it Coleridge's intense experience of the imagination in Kublai Khan, or for that matter in The Ancient Mariner, be it Blake's intensity for The Chimney Sweeper, be it Lamb's intensity in The Dream Children. The stylistic keynote is intensity. And that, of course, comes to a climax in Shelley. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. And its watchword for Romanticism is, of course, imagination. Now, what the imagination is not just one definition for the Romantics. It comes through in many definitions of many of these Romantic poets. So we'll reserve that for the time being and move on to our next slide, which asks the question, was there one Romanticism or were there many Romanticisms? Right. Take somebody like Byron, for example, who was a revolutionary, no doubt, but who worked through the apparatus of satire. Now, Romanticism is also the era of the historical novel, aka Walter Scott. Or Romanticism is also the age of Jane Austen, who who moves through realism. So my point being that, and this is not my point really, in 1924, Lovejoy had talked about many romanticisms. Now, you see, the romanticism of Wordsworth, for example, is very different from the romanticism of Shelley. Right, Wordsworth is far more conservative, Shelley is far more revolutionary. Now, also remember, and this is something which I cannot touch upon in the course of my short lecture, is that Romanticism was transcendental. I'm sorry, transnational. I'm very sorry, excuse me for that slip. Transnational in the sense that, theorists or philosophers like Herder, Schiller, poets like Goethe would bring in a very distinct German quality to it. We'll also see how within the paintings themselves there are, French romanticisms that take place. So this is one of the aspects to note, that romanticism was not restricted to England. Now, for my convenience, of course, the poets that I will refer to are all British poets. But the paintings that I'll be showing will be across the continent. And also remember that the movement was not restricted to literature alone. There was, of course, Gothic architecture. There was music, romantic music, especially Mozart. There was romantic painting, which we shall shortly see across the continent. Therefore, Romanticism was dispersed across different cultural forms. And the other question is, while Romanticism moved away substantially from the early 18th century discourse of reason, there were certain continuities with ideas of the Enlightenment, especially the idea of sensibility that the Enlightenment had generated. Also remember that the Enlightenment itself was talking about progress. The Enlightenment was talking about liberty. So in a certain sense, Romanticism had a very Janus-faced, that is, two opposite reactions to Romanticism. As to the Enlightenment, it borrowed certain aspects, there were certain continuities, yet there were certain ruptures and discontinuities as well. And the Romantics also, by bringing in this notion of selfhood, intensity, imagination, were also looking at newer concepts of the protagonist, for example, individualism, history, society, and aesthetic. So from Romanticism to modernism lies another journey that is very interesting in the history of ideas. Now let me take you back to what was Romanticism reacting against. And therefore, I come to neoclassical perfections. Now, if you go back to my initial title, you see, I've used ratios, proportions, which the neoclassicals, so the new classicals of the Augustan age were looking at, right? So ratio, proportion, balance, harmony. And therefore, let me come back to these neoclassical perfections. And very importantly, we come across the most important theoretical work on Romanticism by M.H. Abrams, who talks about the difference between the mirror and the lamp. Abrams talks about Augustinism as defined by the metaphor of the mirror. Now, the Augustines believed art is to be a reflector, and the artist is envisioned as the agent holding up the mirror to nature. Now, this you've seen in Dr. Johnson, Pope, even Dryden, that art will hold up a mirror to nature. And what kind of a mirror will it hold? It will hold a mirror of balance, perfection, and social harmony. Right? So the scattered beauties generic humanity, average forms, familiar appearances, all will be seen within this world of non-chaos, even when it is seen in terms of chaos. Say, for example, in the Dunciad, or say, for that matter, in Dryden's Macflecno. The poet will satirize that and try to bring in a world which is in harmony with nature. That, I think, is very important for the Augustans. Right. So prior to Romanticism, Horace as the intellectual precursor, Horace does not believe in immediacy or spontaneity. He says, keep the work 9 years. The work of art should maintain decorum. The poet should not hurry to publish. He should follow classical masters. So no innovation, no originality. Imitation should be the most important form of expression, and symmetry should be the aim of the artist. So balance, symmetry, imitation of the classical masters. What is the function of art according to Horace? The function of art according to Horace, as well as we saw in Addison in the last class, was utile over dulce, or it was the concept of utility over pleasure. Science is seen as the new religion and a new paganism. Narratives are moral to reform human beings. External spaces and transactional practices. So the neoclassicist will look at the external spaces and try to order them into a symmetry. And of course, the neoclassicist will always look and majorly look for urban concerns and spaces. Now, many of you are reading Blake's London, and you will see how London becomes this gigantic kind of a figure in the neoclassical literatures, something which the novelists respond to. And as J. Paul Hunter says, that all literature is, in a way, in a hurry to reach London. Now, for the Romantics, like Blake, like Wordsworth, like Keats, look at the metaphors of London. London provides mind-forged manacles. According to Blake, it is a space of exploitation where the chimney sweeper's cry can be heard. For Wordsworth, the city is praised for being unlike the city. For Keats, the city is like a pent, a place where pigs are enclosed. Right? So the Romantics turn this focus from London to the countryside. Right? So in a certain sense, the movement of the Romantics is for the lost countryside, which they seek to foreground in their texts. Now let me see a few paintings to show what the neoclassicists were trying to do. Look at this painting by Angelica Kauffmann. This is titled The House of the Earl of Gower, who was a well-known politician of the age, date 1772. Now, if you look at that picture of the family, it's a picture of harmony, isn't it? The children are playing. There's the patriarch who sits with a scroll in his hand. There's a boy with a book just by his side. So he's educating, the patriarch is educating the male heir to his family. And there is the bust of a classicist, of a classical individual who looks almost like the Earl of Gower. And you can see the women in the margins. So it's a perfect kind of a semicircle where the perfect order of the family is maintained, right? So this is what the sense of perfection, utility, symmetry, decorum that the painting seeks to foreground. Now, take a look at what William Hogarth, one of the most important painters of the 18th century, seeks to highlight. And Hogarth's text is titled An Analysis of Beauty. And Hogarth creates this structure of the serpentina within a pyramid. So there is variety, there is excess, but that excess must be contained within the tight shape of the pyramid. So symmetry, there, if even if there are discrepancies and excesses, they must finally be contained within the structure of the pyramid. So it highlights the concept of order over excess. Remember this painting, because I'll come back to this in a separate sort of painting from Blake. Now, this is Hogarth's Rake's Progress, and you can see this young man who is living a life of pleasure, who's wasting his father's money, probably going to a gym and so on and so forth. And this, not gym really, is going to a prostitute's place. And then finally he becomes mad, loses his money, and is put in a madhouse, right? And therefore, the moral, this painting has an excess of the rake raving as a mad individual. But remember that what the rake does is part of a moral sequence of 6 paintings, which shows that if you waste money and if you live a life of pleasure, your end will be extremely pathetic. So even if there is a darkness, there is an excess within the painting, it is part of a greater moral canvas. So the serpentina within the pyramid. Of course, I mentioned science, ordering, explanation, and rationality. And this is a very famous painting by Joseph Wright. It's titled A Philosopher Giving That Lecture on the Array. This is 1766. And you can see there's this model of the solar system, which the philosopher is expressing by candlelight. And you can see the children and the listeners rapt in attention, seeking not sublimity, not the sun in all its splendor or the planets in all their mystery, but all the mystery is as it were being explained in a small model. Science, rationality, therefore, are paramount. Now, this is a very interesting picture, rather painting. This is by Thomas Gainesborough, and it's titled Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, 1748. Now, Gainesborough is one of the very important path breakers, as it were, in terms of the landscape painting in England. And if you look at that landscape, you will find that that landscape is not wild. It is extremely ordered, pristine, and man and nature seem to exist, or man seems to be in foreground of nature. He seems to be in control over both the woman as well as nature. And therefore, everything is a picture of peace, perfection, light, order, and so on and so forth. Look at that picture very carefully, because I'm going to come back in a little while to show you a different version of nature when the Romantics use it. So this is prior to the Romantics. And look at a poem by Alexander Pope, when Pope talks about Windsor Forest. Now, contrast this with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, which you must be reading. Wordsworth talks about the ruins of the abbey and the desolate wildness of nature. What does Pope talk about? Pope talks about order in variety, where though all things differ, all agree. There, interspersed in lawns and opening glades, thin trees arise that shun each other's shades. Just take a look at this painting and read this poem. They're wrapped in clouds, the bluish hills ascend. Not proud Olympus yields a nobler sight than what more humble mountains offer here. See Pan with flocks and fruits. Here blushing Flora paints the enameled ground. Rich industry. So nature is industry here. Nature is a source of money and wealth. sits smiling on the plains, and peace and plenty tell. So you can imagine peace and plenty telling a Stuart reigns. Now let me come to the Romantics. Now, I've already given you the 5 dominant features of Romanticism, but the most important landmark of the Romantics, of course, is the way in which they deal with the concept of nature, right? And therefore, this is once again Bloom. Bloom suggests that the metaphorical, the most defining characteristic of Romanticism is the way in which there is a profound change in the spatial projection of reality, in the way in which nature is projected. How does this nature projection change? The metaphorical structure of Romantic poetry tends to move inside. Take a look at the earlier painting, it moved into the outside. Now, nature poetry is moving inside and downward within the mind of the poet, instead of outward and outside. Hence, the creative world is deep within. Therefore, when Coleridge talks about Kublai Khan, and he talks about the sacred river that runs down to a mysterious sea, he's talking about that inspiration which runs deep into the mind of the poet. And as Wordsworth will see it in Tintern Abbey, that inward eye will look into the life of things, right? So outward reality of the daffodils immediately impinge upon the inward eye, and then that allows the poet a deeper vision to look into the life of things. And therefore, the best romantic meditations on a landscape all manifest a transaction between the subject and the object. So the object is nature and the subject is the poet. And there is an intense sort of interaction. So the subject is not merely looking and holding up a mirror to nature. He is reflecting upon it through the inward eye, and then coming up with his own version of nature, in which the thought incorporates and makes explicit which was already implicit in the outer scene. So the symbolic aspect of nature, the deeper readings of nature, right? So nature is a nurse. Nature offers man a glimpse into the life of things. When the Romantic poet confronted a landscape, that distinction between the self of the Romantic poet and the non-self, that is nature. So Pope is looking at nature like a non-self, but Wordsworth, the boundary between I and nature seems to dissolve, right? Now, while the extreme assertion of the self, and that is one of the features of Romanticism which I discussed, this is a quote from Drabble, by the way, Margaret Drabble, and the use of nature as a stimulus for the poet to engage in thinking are crucial features of Romanticism. Remember, they did not appear just with Wordsworth. So one fine morning, Wordsworth comes in and says, no, look, I'm going to write differently about nature. That did not happen. Between 1726 and 1730, so almost, say, 70 years prior to the publication of Lyrical Ballads, James Thomson writes The Seasons. Nature here is understood as an expression of divine force. And Thomson's moral reflections often give the impression of not being imposed on nature from the outside. So external nature is not just the topic, but the internal reflection on nature. So similarly, when you're reading the Lucy poems, for example, it's not just 3 years she grew in sun and shower, but what Lucy and nature has meant to the poet. I know no subject more ready to awaken the poetical enthusiasm than the works of nature. So this enthusiasm, this reading, this penetration of nature by the self of the poet, the collapsing of the distance between the self and the non-self, is what romanticism seeks to do. And let us take a look at two paintings by the man who was most in sync with nature painting, as it were, with landscape painting, and very importantly, sort of linked with Wordsworth, is John Constable. We're looking at the Hay Wain, 1821, a pristine kind of a picture of nature. You can see the light and the shade. You can see here the kind of a quaint little house of the villager who is engaged in his daily activities. And you can see the wild animals. You can see the wildness of nature. Take a look at this. Light, perfect blending, perfect nature. Here you see wildness of nature, untamed. And in the next painting, which Constable considered his best work yet, you can see the rainbow there on Salisbury Cathedral. You can see the cathedral, you can see the kind of sublime storms that are about to rage, and you can see, the cathedral standing and the rainbow gradually coming. You can see the light and shade. Constable, of course, referred to this as chiaroscuro, the light and shade effect. You can see the wildness of nature, right? Therefore, this is the Wordsworthian version. If you read the first verse paragraph of Tintern Abbey, for example, this is the landscape that Wordsworth is seeking to paint. And very importantly, this rural background, this rural landscape, is something that the poet and the painter knows is collapsing, is moving away, and it will be gone. So the return to this kind of a landscape, the Lake District, for example, is something that both the poet and the painter seek to do, to free himself from the ruptures and the sufferings of urban life, right? So the creation of the rural landscape, the creation of nature as sublime, as a panacea, as a cure for their mental depressions, is what mysterious, something that is eternal, is what Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley all try to do. And contrast this now with a picture which Turner, William Turner, one of the most famous British poets, brings in 1840. And this is a different nature. You see, this is the picture of rain, steam, and speed. Now, this is well into the Industrial Revolution. Remember, this is after Romanticism, into the Victorian era, right? And you have rain, and you can see the automobile plunging through the landscape. It is sort of coming to the foreground in all its force, in all its speed, rupturing the landscape, as it were, the canvas, as it were. And then that becomes the symbol of an industrial revolution that will pierce the peace of nature of the Romantics, right? And you can also see that this is the harbinger of the vigorousness of the Victorian era. Now, if you think about Tennyson's Lotus Eaters, for example, you'll find that the Lotus Eaters seek to go backward into a life of indolence, into a life of leisure, right? And Ulysses is the figure of that, the figure of that automobile who urges them forward into a life of great activity, piercing, as it were, the stasis of the earlier age. This is, of course, the Great Western Railway, modernity coming in full force to rupture the Romantic canvas. Now, this again, of course, also these three paintings will bring something into the aura of Romanticism. And that is the element of the sublime. right? Something that's scary, something that is transcendental, ephemerally beautiful. It will cause fear, awe, and intensity. Now, in this case, the fear of the sublime nature, in this case, the awe of that machine. And here in Turner's The Slave Ship, which was once again painted 1840, Turner painted this ship called the Zong, Zong, which, when it was coming to harbor, it realized that a large number of the slaves that were, put in this ship were all sort of ill and were liable to die. To save the insurance money, therefore, the slave ship threw off 130 odd people, slaves, overboard, who died in the river. And you can see the horror, the fear of that slave ship, the bodies thrashing around in the water. This is a painting that communicates the horror of that particular moment. Remember that this is a painting which showcases the sublime, the kind of Gothic fear. And it was important painting, really, because of this painting, actually, a lot of debate was articulated on the abolition of slavery. So we've seen the Romantic poet looking at nature, and let me take you back once again through these paintings. The mystery of nature, the reading of nature, sort of kindling a kind of emotion within the poet, so that the distance between the poet and the non-poetic, or the object, the self and the non-self, is erased. There's the earlier order is dissipated. Nature is presented in all its wildness, its symbolism. And therefore, from this painting, when you move to this, you can see how nature becomes such a crucial object in Romanticism. Now comes the question of the poet. Now, for the Augustans, the poet was somebody who had classical learning, who was well versed in society, who would lead to the reform in society, who would criticize vice and be an upholder of virtue, and who would be moral rather than who would create any kind of disorder or anarchy. Now, how does it change in Romanticism? Because this is fundamental to your study of Romanticism, the idea of the Romantic poet. Now, for the Romantic poet, imagination is prioritized. So the poet must possess this inward eye. For Wordsworth, for Coleridge, he must possess the secondary imagination. I'll come to the secondary imagination in a moment. Shelley will see the poet as a prophet who can transform the universe. And therefore, the poet will be an interface between nature and human society, because the poet will take his material, his kind of transformational potential from nature itself. The poet will be marked by sensibility, intense capacity for emotions and feeling, and his association with the marginalized. So the poet is not an ordinary human being. He is marked by an intensity and a capacity to feel. Now think about our own poet, Rabindranath, of course. The way in which he feels the seasons impinging upon his self, his imagination, right? Think about Wordsworth, for example, in the way in which nature sort of becomes a source of emotions to him. Very importantly, the poet will have a visionary power, and therefore Shelley will call him the unacknowledged legislator of the world. So he is the one who will, like Prometheus, and Shelley writes a poem on Prometheus, he will bring fire to man, even though he has to suffer for it. And he will also be aware that he will be defeated by society. He will face loneliness, ruin. The romantic poet is essentially a lonely figure, right? Think about Wordsworth retiring into nature. Think about, figures like the ancient mariner, once again extremely lonely. Think about Shelley's poet, falling upon the thorns of life I bleed. Think about Keats, the lonely poet, nursing his brother and being rejected in love. Therefore, major themes of Romanticism will include solitude, right? The Wordsworthian dictum, that memory which is rekindled in solitude. Ruin. Think about Tintern Abbey and the ruins. Think about Keats, the fever, the fret of life. Fragmentation. The romantic poet is essentially fragmented, is torn off, and even his personality is split into many parts. And decay. Decay is also another major theme within Romanticism. However, in spite of this, the romantic poet will create utopias, right? He will create a skylark, for example. Keats, despite his suffering, will look for eternity in the season of autumn. Wordsworth will think about nature as a refuge and then see into the life of things and transfer it into his sister, and also in the Lucy poems. Therefore, but remember that between Wordsworth and Coleridge, the first generation romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and of course Robert Southey, and between Shelley, Keats, Byron, you have a generational shift. Wordsworth and Coleridge far more, located within the conservative circle, locating within a certain sense of aesthetics, whereas Shelley, Keats, Byron, far more revolutionary, moving towards a far greater opening up of poetry. Now comes this term imagination, which all of us really grapple with. What exactly is the imagination, right? Now that's Coleridge. That's one of the most famous quotations. Almost every single student of literature has somewhere or the other struggled with that quotation. I know because I have, right? And Coleridge says, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and the prime agent of all human perception, and a repetition in the finite mind of the external act of creation in the infinite I am. So, therefore, the primary imagination is a recreation of the infinite. The finite imagination, as it were, captures an image within itself. The secondary, he says, coexists with the conscious will. So the secondary is the imagination, which is the active imagination of the poet, which can transform this, captured picture with its kind of agency, its kind of power, and dissolving, diffusing, dissipating in order to recreate, right? So it sort of dissolves, it sort of completely sort of changes, reforms, readjusts, fragments. So there is this image which is captured of the girl, the solitary reaper, singing. And then Wordsworth's imagination can then rework, dissolve it so that he creates this fascinating figure silhouetted against the highland, this lass who sings of a melancholy strain. And then it becomes the poet. What does that mean, right? And what effect does that have? Very importantly, the imagination is also associated with the power to move. For the romantic poet, poetry must have the power through the imagination, by creation of the imagination, to move its audience, to create a similar effect, sensibility within the mind of the audience. So where it struggles, imagination struggles to idealize and to unify. So take a look at the Lucy poems, for example, or Tintern Abbey. It's a view of the Tintern Abbey with all its wildness and nature. And then Wordsworth's mind comes into operation upon it, the secondary imagination, and then talks about his own fears, his own anxieties about the French Revolution, the rejection by Annette Vallon, and then his healing and his ability to come to terms with human suffering. Say in the Lucy poems, seeing nature in all its pleasures, in all its wildness, but then embodied in the figure of Lucy is the woman, is the girl who will become part of nature itself, where there's a merging of the human and the non-human, right? So that is the power of the imagination. Now take a look at Shelley again. And that is very important because I've chosen Shelley and and Coleridge primarily because they represent different generations of the Romantics. Shelley has a different take, as it were. Coleridge does not make a very tall claim for the poet. He says, yes, the poet is special. But he does not say that the poet can change the world. And Shelley makes that claim. Shelley suggests that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And for him, the human mind performs two very important and very different mental actions. It reasons and it imagines. So Shelley goes back to reason and says, reason contemplates the relation of one thought to another. Now, in your Mask of Anarchy, for example, which we'll be doing, Shelley is talking about why anarchy can operate. And in this case, anarchy is absolute powers can operate and how they operate. So they will operate with, ignorance. They will operate with violence, and so on and so forth. So that's a rational basis, right? But what the imagination does is the production of thoughts, in effect, being the synthesis or interpretation of the forms from existence itself. Therefore, then for Shelley, you will find the figure of hope coming in. And hope will then rekindle the other things. And therefore, Shelley's thought, Shelley's imagination comes of creating an utopia beyond this anarchy, right? So Shelley argues that poetry is the expression of the imagination and connate with the origin of man. He says poetry is the production of human values and concepts. So by producing human values, laying down the values and law the world lives by, poetry is a legislation of the world. So when we see this kind of a Mask of Anarchy, we will realize how Shelley sort of brings in both reason and the imagination to work in tandem, to envision a world created by the poet where absolutism can be destroyed and where perfection can be achieved. And therefore, we saw in the earlier age, the metaphor was that of the mirror. For the Romantic poet, then, it is the lamp. And that is again M.H. Abrams. Abrams suggests a work of art, and I want you to read this quotation carefully. A work of art is essentially the internal made external. So if earlier it was the external world held up through a mirror, here it is the internal world of the poet made external, resulting from a creative process operating under the impulse of feeling. So Wordsworth's feeling for nature, Coleridge's feeling for liberty, right? So creative process operating under the impulse of feeling, the poet who can feel much more, and embodying the combined product of the poet's perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. The paramount cause of poetry is not a final cause, the effect intended upon the audience, but instead an efficient cause the impulse within the poet of feelings and desires seeking expression. So that is why when I talk about immediacy, when I talk about subjectivity, spontaneity of the romantic poet, which seeks expression, or the compulsion of the creative imagination, which, like God the creator, has its internal source of motion. So Romanticism has its own sort of mechanics, its own imperative motion, which operates like God the creator. And let me here come to the paintings I want to show you. This is the German painter Caspar Friedrich, the wanderer above a sea of fog. And you can see the silhouetted and the sort of kind of the figure of the poet against this vast expanse of nature, the solitary, lonely figure who has scaled the mysteries of nature and is looking into the mysteries of a nature that is blurred, right? So this is the poet through whom we can take a look at a reality that he seeks to create. The reality of the ancient mariner, it may be, the reality of a Tintern Abbey, it may be, the reality of the Mask of Anarchy, it may be, the reality of a Grecian urn, it may be. Then comes this concept of the Sleep of Reason by Goya, the Spanish painter, 1797. And you can see the lonely poet asleep, the lonely figure, and the monsters kind of coming to the monstrous birds, the owl, the mysterious coming to operate. Once again, the irrational, the kind of supernatural that Coleridge brings here. And you can immediately think about Christabel or the ancient mariner here, and how, within this sleep, within this motion of this poet's imagination, monstrous forms interplay and create a sublime kind of artifact, right? So the romantics, therefore, are figures who feel more, right? And therefore, they are marked by what we will call sensibility. And this sensibility comes through a lot of philosophers like Shaftesbury, Hutchinson, Hume, and Adam Smith, who suggest that sensibility is sociability. When you feel for others. Reason can distance you from the other. You can say it's not my problem, it's his problem. But when you feel, you empathize, you sympathize, you feel for others. Now let me come to Blake, because many of you have been reading Blake in your syllabi. And you can see that you have this figure recurrently within Blake of Newton with the compass. By the way, this is a sculpture that is found just in front of the British Library. So Newton with a compass, sort of circumscribing the universe, creating a ratio. You see, Blake writes, "He who sees the infinite in all things sees God. He who sees the ratio sees himself only." So when Blake sees the tiger, he sees the infinite power of God, right? And he brings in this notions of dichotomous notions of innocence and experience, right? And that line which moves infinitely rather than within the ratio and proportion of the Augustan poet. And you see, this is once again the actual picture of how Blake created, manuscripts of the Lamb. And you can see those distinct, sorry for the typo, sharp and wiry bounding line. Now let me take you back once again, because I promised that I would bring you back to this kind of a picture of that wiry line, which is kind of enclosed by the pyramid. But in Blake gives free flow to the form, and therefore this wiry line with its intricacies, talking about the lamb and the tiger, and setting free, as it were, the imagination to work upon. then my next point. So we've talked about how nature is important to Romanticism, point number one. Point number two, we've talked about the distinctness of the Romantic poet. Now, let us talk about how Romantics become revolutionaries. And let me pause here for a sip of water, please. Now, it might be reminded to you, of course, that revolution, of course, was located within the Enlightenment itself. The idea of freedom, individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of trade, right? Therefore, very importantly, you must acknowledge that Romanticism in this aspect was sort of bringing forward the idea of freedom from the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment had its difficulties as well. It promoted free trade. It promoted slavery. It promoted conservative governments, taxes, so that freedom from the colonizer became freedom from the aristocracy, from the brutalizing monarchy became a theme for the Romantics. And there were two very important revolutions, as you know, one being the American Revolution and the other 1776, and the French Revolution 1789, right? Therefore, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, for example, who looked at the French Revolution, who admired it, but then recoiled against its violence. Contrast this and became more conservative. Whilst take a look at poets like Shelley or Byron, who actually fought for the revolution, who actually continuously talked about liberty, talked about this figure of Prometheus who would bring the fire of freedom to the human soul, and who remained revolutionaries till their deaths. Of course, both of them died young. So there were these debates about liberty. And the one poet one philosopher who sort of affected the latter Romantics were, of course, Tom Paine, where Paine suggested that all hereditary government is in its nature tyranny, and that to inherit a government is to inherit the people as if they were flocks and herds. So Paine is this archetypal kind of a figure who protests against any form of government, be it the government of the day, the government of the family, whatever. But look at Wordsworth, for example, talking about the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. But then again, it's the same Wordsworth who, when the revolution fails, he talks about he's scared of the revolution. He comes back and seeks refuge within nature and talks about what man has made of man. See, to her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me lan, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. So when Wordsworth comes back to the Lucy poems, or when Wordsworth comes back to nature, he's talking about the eternal cycle of life rather than the revolutionary zeal, which is afraid of, which he turns against, right? So, but at the same time, poets like Shelley or Byron would be, greatly inspired by this revolution, and so would a host of other poets across the continent. Let me see how paintings refer to this. This is Eugene Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, 1830. Many of you who had history in your class 12 courses and you studied CBSE will remember this painting. Here is France with, you see Marianne, the figure of liberty, with the tricolor of France, and who is holding this in the face of expression. And you see people dying all across her, the violence all around her. But Marianne holds the figure of the flag of liberty. This is Francisco Goya, 2nd of May, 1808. This was painted in 1814. Now, in 1808, Napoleon's forces tried to overrun the Spanish, and the Spanish resisted. And this resulted in a brutal kind of resistance and fight against the Napoleonic army. As a result of which, 3rd May, these people were all court-martialed and died. Right? They were put before firing squads. But together, these two pictures once again talk about the rise of the dominated against the domineering, against the forces of tyranny. Right? Remember these paintings when you do Shelley, because for Shelley, this figure of hope and revolution will be extremely important. Now the question is, how will Shelley respond to this notion of violence? That we shall see subsequently. Right. So the point being that Romanticism, situated as it was in history, was essentially reacting to revolution. Right. In certain cases, like Wordsworth, there was an initial attraction towards it and a repulsion by the violence, whereby Wordsworth became more conservative. And some, like Shelley or Byron, who were inspired by the revolution and who tried to keep the flag of revolution flying through their poetry, and thereby Shelley's poet becoming the harbinger of the revolution, right? The west wind which will blow through him and create within the world the music of revolution once again, or for that matter, the Masque of Anarchy, where this figure of Marianne will be the figure of hope, who will seek to protest against any form of absolutism. Now, in the last segment of this rather long lecture, I realize I'm trying your patience, but then I think it's important to bring together these major themes. We come to this question of visions, nightmares, and the sublime, right? And when I talk about the sublime, many of you will immediately wonder what exactly is the sublime. Now, the term sublime, of course, comes from the Greek hypsos, Hypsous, and the Greek philosopher Longinus, Longinus, Longinus talked about on the sublime. Remember, hypsos is elevation. Hype comes from that word, right? So elevation, sublimity elevates. Sublimity is when poetry or art can create feelings that are not normal, of elevated within us. Remember, what are the feelings that are elevated? Awe, fear, grief. These are when your mind and your sensibility operate beyond the normal. So this is the idea of the sublime, which was articulated by the British writer Edmund Burke in 1757. Burke suggests that sublimity rises from terror. Pleasure follows the will, and thereafter we are generally affected with it. So strength, violence, pain, and terror are ideas that rush upon the mind together. So a grand and commanding conception is what Burke is actually talking about. So the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature is astonishment. Now, when you read your Ancient Mariner, for example, you were astonished. You were fearful, awestruck by the moment of this ghost ship and the moment when the albatross is struck down and it brings a curse upon the mariner, right? You remember the wedding guest who's sort of becomes a figure of fascination. Think about Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, when nature creates an elevation within the soul, right? Where he's suspended suspended in body and becomes just a mind, pure mind. Think about Shelley's moment in The Masque of Anarchy, when hope comes and creates a moment of astonishment and awe, which defeats the power of anarchy, as it were. which all its motions are suspended, and some degree of horror. And that is why you see, the just prior to the 18th century, you have this moment of the Gothic, where horror is articulated in the novel. Say a text like Dracula, for example, right, which creates this notion of horror. If you ever watched a horror film, have you ever wondered why you love horror? I would say fear is not something which you'd like to, normally experience, would you? You'd rather be less than fear in your life. But what propels us to watch horror films, read horror stories? Because it creates a kind of heightened state in our mind. And it's within that heightened state, right, that you experience a kind of a pleasure. Right? Say, think about the tiger, right? That beating tiger poem, tiger, tiger, burning bright. The trochaic meter, creating the pulsating moment of violence almost, and fear of what fearful hand or eye dare create thy fearful symmetry. Right, that moment of sublimity of fear and awe and astonishment. Right. So the romantic poet is looking at this moment of fear, awe, supernatural astonishment, be it in Coleridge's Christabel, be it in the Ancient Mariner. And the idea of the sublimity is also related with the idea of infinity, right? Not with the idea of touching the beyond of reality. Infinity has a tendency to fill the mind with that delightful horror and the sublime. The eye not being able to perceive the bounds of many things, they seem to be infinite. Read Coleridge, for example. Read, say for that matter, even Shelley's poems, which seek to touch the infinite. The Skylark, for that matter, or the West Wind, which will create such a status within the poet that he'll sort of try and touch the boundaries of reason, right? And of course, this ultimate sublimity is very often related with religious poetry, because the divine is also transcendental. But we'll not go into this, because romantic poetry does not really talk about religion and the divine God. Rather, it moves away from it. Now let us look at a few paintings. The first is the painting by Henry Fuseli, the Italian, who in 1781 paints this nightmare, this woman who's reclining and is sort of in her nightmare, and there's this beast upon her body, the body which is invitingly lying open for our gaze, and you see the horror there, the darkness, the white body of the woman and the darkness of the beast. You can think about the Dracula, you can think about the albatross when you think about this. But this is where sublimity is created through the interplay of light, the vision, and the nightmare. Now this is Goya, and the theme is of Satan devouring his own children, right? Again, you could see this, this figure with its big eyes, the blood, the body of the child being devoured. It's a moment of pure terror and fear, right? And this is Géricault, the French painter, and it's very celebrated painting called The Raft of the Medusa. Now, this was based on another ship which was grounded, and in a raft, almost 180 sailors sailed to try and reach Senegal, and many of them died on the raft, and they turned to cannibalism. Now, remember, this is very important in the sense because you can read this, see this picture in consonance with words with Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner. The fear, the nightmare, the horror, the kind of encroachment of the beastly within the human, and the kind of revulsion, fascination, horror that is generated within the mind of the viewer, the interplay of darkness, the the kind of psychological entry into a state of extreme anxiety, a state of extreme madness, as it were, right? Therefore, we have taken a look in the essay, in our lecture, on the different aspects of Romanticism. And we've talked about different facets. We've talked about the romantic definition of a Romanticism. We've talked about the changing perception of Romanticism through nature. And we've seen how it contrasts with the earlier Augustan idea. We've talked about how Romanticism can be seen through the differing perspective of the poet. How does the poet change in Romanticism? We've talked about how the revolution impacts Romanticism, and how how Romanticism is a mode of revolution in itself. And we've also seen the impact of nightmare, supernatural wedded to beauty, the sublimity that lies within the romantic movement. Now, all of you will also have to remember that technically too, Romanticism was a revolution, in the sense that it was trying to bring disparate elements together. It was rejecting the Augustan contemporaneity, or looking at the reality and withdrawing into a kind of a medievalism, say in Keats, or say in Coleridge, the Ancient Mariner, for example. It was also sort of trying to bring different poetic registers together, like the lyric and the ballad together. It was prioritizing the country over the city and seeking to go back to that idealized version of country life. Therefore, in many ways, technically, the Romantics were also seeking to revolutionize things. At the same time, you can argue also that many of the Romantics were falling back upon the classical forms. Say Keats, when he writes about the Grecian urn, uses the form of the ode. Or Shelley, for that matter, is using the ottava rima as a kind of a sort of poetic device. Shelley is, of course, going back also to the classical forms, the masque, for example. Right? Therefore, Romanticism is in this, as I said, two-faced relationship with the past. While it seeks to break away from the past in certain aspects, it continues with the same past in certain other aspects. But what is important is a heightened intensity of feeling of the romantic poet, which all of them share, their perception of nature, their perception of the poet, and the collapse of the self and the non-self in their poetry, the importance of nightmare and the self-rendered imaginative vision of society. Now, imagination is the key word once again. For the Romantics, it is imagination which works upon the reality and produces a kind of a super reality for the romantic poet. And this super reality is what the romantic poet seeks to achieve. Very often, the super reality is marked by the sublime, fear, anxiety, revolution. And therefore, the romantic poet falls back upon the theme of revolution, freedom to express, freedom to move away from the shackles of the city, freedom to move away from the shackles of reason, and thereby arrive at a different destination. It is this extreme individualism of the romantic poet and individual that is crucial for you to understand what Romanticism as a movement meant. See, when you say you are a romantic, it might mean you are always falling in love. But if you look at it in a different philosophical way, then what does being a romantic today mean? It means your subjectivity is intense. Your imagination is intense. You have a creative spontaneity. You have a lamp within you which does not hold the mirror up to reality, but which recreates reality differently within your selfhood. And secondly, you have this ability to feel. You have this ability to be revolutionary, to think about the transcendental, and to look at nature in a different way altogether. Let me come back to my next slide. Romanticism, as Baudelaire suggested, is precisely situated neither in the choice of subject. So the Augustans and the Romantics talked about the same subjects, but they talked about it differently, in a way of feeling. And this would once again be challenged when we come to the movement of modernism. But that is a different story altogether, one which we may take up at some point of time in the future. It is with this, therefore, that I bring my presentation to a close. And let me therefore suggest that you go back to this movement of Romanticism, re-visualize and re-evaluate it, create a map within these parameters where you can place your different poems and your different poets, and then take a look at it. Then it will become far easier for you to understand this complex movement called Romanticism. This then is a brief introduction to the subject. In our next discussion, we shall take up the poetry of Shelley, and we will begin with Shelley's slightly largish poem called The Mask of Anarchy. Right, but that remains for another session. Thank you for your patience. It's been a rather longish presentation, but I hope this has brought for many of you a kind of a comprehensive idea of how the Romantics functioned or what Romanticism meant. I have tried to intersperse this presentation with the major quotations that you might fall back upon while understanding Romanticism. If this proves helpful to you, I think my effort will not have been in vain. Right. Thank you. And it is with that then again that I am ending this broadcast of mine.